Welcome to the discussion of today's golden age of games investment. As Jim mentioned, I've been in the field for 35 years. I started as a game designer, and recently my 1984 game, Paranoia, was the third best performing Kickstarter in the tabletop games category. So you'll have to rush out and get it in July when it's published. But we're here to talk about the money side of matters. So a lot of you hear advice on, a lot of you hear or read advice on the finance scene, and I want to provide you some context so you can decide at what level you receive this advice. So I have, as an advisor, board member, or consultant, participated in over 50 financings in the last 11 years. Over 20 of them were in games, and 30 included a game line of business. There were four down rounds. There were 4 down rounds in those, and there are 2 I'm very proud of. They were in 2009 when the world financial credit system was crashing, and when we were worried about things like food, water, and the most essential virtual goods, and VCs were not putting out much money, and those closed. I've done over 25 from the investor side, including due diligence. The territories in which I've done work include North America, Western Europe, though generally Northern Western Europe, so nothing in Spain or Italy, and Eastern Asia, the big 3 of China, Japan, and Korea. And I try and be accountable since I speak at many conferences. Some of the good ones that I've given were that the 2010-2011 peak financing in games would end in mid-2011. It trickled off in November. You can see the social casino predictions I made from 2 years ago on the Casual Connect site, and Zynga and King are also online. I was, in terms of predictions that were absolutely wrong, I did in 2008 and 2009, I misread how Twitter would do well, but I was back predicting, making predictions about Twitter in 2012, since I wanted to not let a few failures get in my way. I did this presentation in consultation with 2 of the top 5 returning venture capitalists in North America and 3 in Europe. Those are Mitch Lasky at Benchmark, whose exits include Riot for $400 million, Gaikai for $380 million, and Natural Motion for $600 and some odd million. Rick Thompson of Signia, who has many exits, including Playdom, which was sold for $750 million, and of which I was a member of the advisory board. Klaus Kirsting, the co-founder of Gameforge and an early investor in Supercell. Jarjo Veskainen, who was the first investor in Supercell and also Boom Lagoon and Next Games, and also Jürgen Golder, who did PrimeSense, one of the biggest acquisitions Apple has done, in addition to Chichilingo. Okay, so for context, the games I'm not going to be referencing real money gaming financing. I will be referring to all other game-related finances, including things like analytics. Anything that relates to the games field are going to be what's covered over here. And I want to start. This talk started because there's been a great deal of mention at conferences and also in the media that, quote, venture capitalists are not interested in investing in games anymore. I will only say that there have been, in the last 12 months, over 100 equity and debt investments in early stage game companies in Western territories. So if you draw the conclusion that there is not money for games, you are being misled. To give you, by the way, my minimum bar for that is $500,000. So these 100 were all $500,000 and up. By the way, forgive me for using dollars. I am American, so that's the frame of reference that I start with. The game investment in China is at an even greater velocity. If you want to get an idea from high level of just how the money is moving in China, I'll discuss that later in the presentation, but also Jim Perkins will be doing a talk later this afternoon on Chinese games M&A. So if you want to do a deeper dive into what is the most active area, the most active country in games, you should go and attend that talk. The aggregate, that is the total US dollar investment in games, is also at an all-time high. And in terms of nominal dollars, and it may actually exceed the peak 2010-2011 venture mini bubble, which was very much concentrated by the Silicon Valley venture capital community, extending out to Boston and New York, and then to London and to Hong Kong. There's simply a hell of a lot more money out there. The one drawback is that the number and breadth and the number of territorial breadth of companies competing for these dollars is also an all-time high. It used to be that the majority of these companies were in very few locations: Boston, San Francisco, Israel, occasionally in London. Now there are investments throughout Eastern Europe and Western Europe. You're seeing companies in Turkey and in the Middle East, and even in the Middle East receiving money, and throughout Asia you're seeing this. So the good news is that for those of you who are seeking money, there's a lot more money out there. However, there are a lot more qualified companies to be able to take after it. And one of the things, of course, is that now that games are a truly global business, that great hits can come out of a one-man shop in Vietnam, like Flappy Bird. VCs are willing to look at a lot more people rather than just people who live within the traditional people who live within 50 miles of their offices and set up their companies there. The investor lineup has also broadened deeply, and their investment interests have evolved for a market that's more global. As I said, it covers almost every continent but for Antarctica, and the penguins better get working on it. They're much more mobile, much more free to play, and much more games as a service. So, again, one of the things that tends to mislead people into thinking that VCs are not investing in games is that the ones who have made the most exits are making fewer investments now, because after you've made an exit in something like Natural Motion or Supercell, your trigger for making an investment becomes, in other words, your hurdle becomes much higher. So what happens is that the best known and most successful North American game VCs are probably Last Gate Benchmark, who I mentioned before, and he said he says officially he's making one investment a year, which obviously reduces the competition. On a practical basis, he will probably make 2 this year. Rick Thompson of Signia had 5 successful exits in the last 6 years, and he's been saying on stage he's doing between 1 and 2 investments for the coming year. And then Tim Chang, who gets quoted a great deal, who was at Norwest and is now at Mayfield, is out of games completely. He's working on the health area. So a lot of people get misled by reading VentureBeat or TechCrunch or some of the other, or even Gamasutra, and they see the names that are attached to big exits are simply not doing much in the way of anything. And it's because they pass the baton to a new generation. I interviewed Lasky after the Natural Motion exit on the VentureBeat stage, and I pointed out that he was the chairman of Snapchat, which is now valued at $10 billion, and of CyanogenMed, which is going to probably hit $1 billion. So these dwarf his game investments. And I asked him, and forgive me for repeating a coarse Americanism, why the fuck he was screwing around in games. And his reply was that he likes games. So apparently he's doing $400 million investments as a bit of a charity. The other set of investors who people miss, Sequoia, which is perhaps the most successful venture capital firm in the world of the last 35 years, has made 5 game investments in the last 5 years, and that doesn't tend to get reported. Kleiner Perkins, which is probably the other most famous company over the last 30 years, recently it had one of the most successful game executives as a partner, Bing Gordon, who was at EA and one of the founding team. But Bing was stripped of his ability to make investments as of a year ago, partly because their Zynga investment, they doubled down on Zynga and they ended up losing money on what an investment they should have made money on. The other firm that's worth noting is Google Ventures. The good news is they make the most investments of any one firm in the world. They've made a lot of game investments. However, the European fund that was set up last year is just finding its way, so we don't yet know how active the European fund is going to be in games. you need to be looking at the lower profile VCs. So Phil Sanderson of IDG is in the West with 8 investments in the last 3 years, the most active institutional investor. Chris Hollenbeck of Granite and even Adam Valken of General Catalyst, a Boston firm people don't tend to notice, but they've invested in CCP, which is EVE Online, Giant Interactive, Super Evil Megacore. They've made a number of investments. So in looking at the landscape, you should just go, they're wonderful resources. If those of you who aren't familiar, Crunchbase is really excellent. That's TechCrunch, Crunchbase will tell you, and you can do some sorts to see who's the most active. But generally, you should look for someone who hasn't made all the greatest killings and is in their active phase for investing. Axel and Index, who were Series A in Supercell and King.com respectively. So they are absolute stars. They both have multi-billion-dollar exits, or make only an average of 1 new investment per year. London Venture Partners is exceptional. They will make multiple game investments, but they are doing things at a very specific amount. If you look at the size of their fund, which is relatively modest, you'll realize that they aren't making, they're more playing in the €500,000, €1 million category. So games are not, the venture capital field is one of trends, and they get excited about things. Games are not this year's bright shiny object, partly because of the failure of Zynga in the market, and partly because of some sectoral issues, which we'll get to on the last slide. So it doesn't get all the buzz compared to a Pinterest, compared to a Snapchat, but it is a category that draws consistent investment, and again, it is out there. So the main increase in those 100 investments is from strategic investments, and that means people who have, companies that have interest in the games field. So Nexon, which is the multi-billion-dollar publisher that started in Korea and has had great success in Japan and Asia, has led with 10 to 14 reported investments. These are structured exactly like venture deals. A number of them are in the category of $5 million, structured like a Series A. The company has its first non-Korean CEO in Owen Mahoney, who was head of M&A for Electronic Arts for many years. They're very sophisticated. They know what they're doing. But there are many other players who are doing this. Perfect World, Tencent, and then a lot of the other players are doing it. A lot of the other European players are doing investments, as I'll discuss later, on Real Money Gaming, which is outside the cloud. The only majors who are not doing much in the way of venture-style investments in games are Activision and Electronic Arts and Ubisoft. So the traditional, not the traditional boxed game people are doing less, but anyone who's a major digital player is making these sorts of investments. They are driven by business imperatives. So when I say breakup developers do not need global publishers, when Imanji developed Temple Run, which became a top 5 grossing title, a number of the major publishers called up and said, "We'll be your global publisher." And Imanji said, reportedly very polite, this husband and wife team said very politely, "We don't need you. We're making a ton of money. We've got, the platforms are featuring us. We don't need you." And that caused all these publishers to panic because they no longer had the ability to get the best titles. So many of these investments are actually not about equity. They are about getting an option, that is, getting the right to be able to invest in a game from a good team. You invest in a good team or a good idea, so that you have the right to a hit before it's a breakout hit, and the company can say, "We don't need you." The publishers need to make sure that they feed their line every year. These are functionally similar to the old development deals. They're basically the equivalent of an advance, except it goes to corporate purposes. And the thing to understand is that they care less about the equity play than they getting some hits. U.S. corporate VCs such as Comcast and Intel have been backing off. Alex Marquez leaving Intel Capital was a key thing. So Google Ventures is, as I said, an outlier, and the European corporates are tending to concentrate on social casino and real money gaming. Asia is the driver of almost everything financial in the games industry. China is, of course, at the epicenter, but Korea and Japan are both huge players. Gree and DNA in Korea, the aforementioned Nexon, NCSoft from Korea. But there's been an explosion of investment that, unless you follow China, it's been invisible. But to give you an idea, there was perhaps more investment going on in China than in all of North America in games than there was in North America last year. A lot of these are by companies unknown in the West. Zhongji, for example, made a $920 million purchase, which is remarkable for being unremarked in the press. I mean, 920 million people, that's 1/3 of a Supercell. That's real money. Yuzu, there's a new company that comes out every time. The key thing, the one thing that is unfortunate about China is it's clearly very, very frothy, and I'll discuss that. And basically, it's showing up as a bubble. The Chinese game market is showing year-on-year growth of 25 to 50%, depending on what numbers. And those of you who follow China know the Chinese statistics are somewhat unreliable, and Jim presumably will say something about that this afternoon. But you can always invest too much money into a category, and that's what I'm afraid is happening in China now. Another category that gets missed is government funding. So there is a couple $100 million every year that goes into game or game-style ventures, jobs for the boys and girls. So that's basically the equivalent of saying, we will give you money, but you have to create jobs in Amsterdam or Rotterdam or something like that. It's almost always tied to the granting country. That's nice. When you have to hire staff, that sounds great. But remember that your objectives and your investors will be different, because they care about keeping jobs over here. You care about growing a company and putting out great games. Sector development, generally governments are not very good at being able to develop industrial sectors that are forward-looking. And I can tell you that almost all governments in the world suck at being able to develop game sectors. This probably will not surprise anyone in this audience. The exception is Korea, which was just brilliant at putting together. They have 2 departments that put things together. They did things including building out the broadband network for game purposes, but Korea is the exception to the rule. There are special purpose funds. Europe specializes in this. There's the European Union Creative Europe Fund, which is one that people go after. It has been observed by a number of lawyers who operate in this sphere that becomes a means to an end. In other words, you become a grant, you become a company that chases after grants if you end up doing multiple things on them. The EU country funds are a lot better because generally they're one-off grants. That is, someone can get $1.5 million euros, and a couple of companies are chosen, games and other sectors. It's a one-time grant. You never see any money again. So if you need growth money, you have to go from other sources. Export promotion has been a big trick for years, but they haven't quite figured out how to load up the trucks with virtual goods. So that's fading for games right now. The most effective way that governments contribute are in tax breaks. And the best example, if you look at what happened in Montreal, which had almost no games industry 10 years ago, but with the basic tax break of 50 cents on every dollar coming back, Montreal is now far and away the largest development center. There are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 games professionals in Montreal, and some of the biggest budget projects. It's past the San Francisco Bay Area, it's past Austin, it's past Seattle, and it's all because the Canadian government basically said, here are the tax breaks, and we will get out of the way. A lot of US companies put money in there, a lot of European companies like to base their North American efforts there. The game super angels, if you can get one of these are probably the best investors for starting a company. They deliver money, but more importantly, they deliver industry connections and knowledge. Jari Ovaskainen, who I mentioned earlier, his playbook is very simple. He wants you to focus on developing a compelling game, and he almost doesn't care about developing the business. He said, do a game and it will come. This has worked brilliantly for Supercell. He's encouraged it with Boom Lagoon and with Next Games. Every VC tells you they want you to take time to do a good game. Jari is one of the few who actually practices what he preaches by saying, here's the condition on which I will give you dollars. Another example is Jürgen Goldner, who was the chairman of Chilingo, and Chilingo famously made a very bad deal with Rovio for Angry Birds, which meant they could take it away at any time. And when they went and made the Zeptolab deal with Cut the Rope, well, I can't discuss the details, it was a hell of a lot more favorable. Jürgen had been making deals for 20 some odd years. North America basically has almost no super angels. Rick Thompson was a great one for 5 years, but he's now set up his own firm. Europe has a relatively few core super angels. Klaus Kirsting, who spoke earlier at this conference. Finland, on the other hand, has a great and active one. Ilkka Pananen of Supercell has made 15 or so investments. The problem is it's all in Finland, and you have to be Finnish, which is a hard trick to pull off if you aren't already. China is superheated. It is the fashionable investment for angels. A lot of people who are the sons and daughters of Politburo members find that the sexy thing to do is games. And when the son of a ranking member of the Politburo asks you for money, you don't care whether it's games, widgets, ducks. You'll make the investment. Japan and Korea have a number of super angels who are the people who've been successful before. Finally, I've done other talks about what you should look for, but I'll just give you some high-end things and then turn it over to a very few questions. You need to understand your prospective investor goals. This is the area that causes people to end up in tears. Most venture capitalists claim they are cowboys. They're actually in the risk reduction business. They're trying to figure out, show us that you've delivered a modest hit, then we'll make an investment in you. There are only a few exceptions like Index, Axel, Benchmark, and Sequoia, who literally are shooting for the biggest hits. Most other ones are actually a hell of a lot more conservative than their press led you to believe. The most important reason about aligning the goals is if your goals are not the same as theirs, it will almost always end in tears, and it will make it more likely that you failed. Right now, games return on investment is perceived as high risk with a modest ceiling. The hits-driven business thing, in other words, if you don't deliver a hit, your investment will fail. Of course, venture capital is actually in the hits-driven business too. Zynga and now King have been Western bellwethers, and their bad performance in the stock market has hurt the perception of games as a good category. The advantage, of course, about the thing is you don't have to spend as much capital to find out whether a game company is going to be successful, so that's a plus. Strategic value is now the thing that is the reason why you see most of the investment coming from companies rather than institutional VCs, because if they get something in their product line that does well, then the investment is a plus. And then lastly, games is the highest growth mass entertainment medium. Whatever problems you see in the games business, it is doing less worse than music, than movies, than books. And it also has the least digital business transition issues. By that, since games basically are the perfect art form for digital, there isn't an issue about taking from CD. There isn't as big an issue from taking from CDs or DVDs or dead tree books to go from there. Anyway, that's an overview, and now we'll turn it over to a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. That's great. I encourage you to stay. We've got a number of sessions on Asia coming up, which is the epicenter of gaming right now, with free-to-play games, mobile games, and online games, PC, and getting into consoles. So those are going to be great sessions to attend as well. We've got time for a couple of questions. I'll open it up to the audience. Who's got questions?
Did I cover everything?
Looks like you did.
I thought it was just a trailer or a teaser, but...
What is going to happen, I've got a question, Eric. What is going to happen to these traditional publishers like Activision and EA and Ubisoft and Take-Two? I mean, they seem to be losing their ground to some of these Asian and other companies that are doing massive revenue and growth rates that they're just not achieving.
What they've got is the franchises. They're essentially in the blockbusters, and their ability to produce it. What was amazing about Activision is they had not previously innovated, but then they delivered a new billion-dollar franchise a couple of years ago. EA, if you look at their numbers, 75 to 80% of their sales are EA Sports. Take-Two is Grand Theft Auto. Ubi actually has probably the most diversified portfolio. They have several big hits, but all those companies are dependent on being able to deliver large franchises. Pretty much that's it. EA is the one that has made the best transition to digital, but because of the demands of the quarterly reports, they have not been able. Their digital progress, which has been pretty darn good for a multi-billion-dollar company, has not been sufficient to move the stock price.
Yeah, and the multiples on stock prices in Hong Kong versus North America and maybe Europe are astoundingly different. The multiples for game companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange are 30, 40, 50 times earnings, whereas they're in the low teens in the North American and European stock exchanges. So again, a massive difference.
And it will chance for one question. Going once, going twice, going three times. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric.